Hello, it's the Great Canoe Bagel here, coming to you with another U.S. Senate forecast update. And just before I get into it, I will just say, as an amendum, in case you did not read the description of the last video, or you watched it after I edited the description, I made a mistake, and I wrote 53 seats here. It was 52 last week, too. I counted the math wrong. I was counting Pennsylvania as a Democrat as having a previous Democrat incumbent. It was a previous Republican. So right now, Pennsylvania is a flip. Oops. When I counted the math, I assumed that I was wrong. Silly me. Doesn't actually change anything about the video other than that number. But here we are. So, some other things I will note. All of these states here with simplified models, do not expect them to have much in the way of changes. There's really not much to say about them because a lot of them, first off, barely have any polling. Some of the more quote-unquote competitive ones like Ohio or Oregon have polling, but some of them, like I believe Alabama, I don't know if there's a single poll out for that race. And since Senate races are so candidate specific, unlike congressional election races, which typically speaking people vote party line on, not entirely, but if you look at the ballots that are split ticket voters, the main thing that gets split is Senate candidate from everything else. If there is going to be a split ticket, because Senate candidate is much more individual notoriety and is generally speaking a more impactful vote than the House candidate, because typically speaking House candidates in the US vote party line, as is the Senate, but senators who break party line are much more notorious, either for good or bad reasons. So another reason why the Senate is generally speaking a more notorious vote, has more, typically the campaigns have more money, they're more notable people, so people are more likely to split ticket on Senate than House. So it's one of the reasons why I get to handle these races separately. And also there's much more wealth of polling for them, so we can indulge it. Whereas some races, like most House races, there might not be a single riding level poll. And even if there is one, that's not very useful because one poll doesn't really work for my model. I can use a single poll and forecast a district, but it's not, has a very hard, it's not a very useful metric. You should very, very large grain of salt with that. Because with any electoral forecast model, this is something you have to make sure you keep in mind here. If it's quoting you percentage, if it's quoting you a margin of error, those are more for show than they actually mean anything. The reason for this is the only thing an polling forecast model, an aggregating forecast model can do is tell you how much someone is going to lead by and which geographies they're going to win. So, for example, I can tell you in Nevada which counties the Republicans are likely to carry and what margin they're likely to carry the counties by and what the margin in Nevada is likely going to be. These things I can tell you because I can take my model's results and I can compare them to the real results. And if I'm wrong on counties or if I'm wrong on vote share, I can try to address that. However, if I say, let's say, Arizona's a 55% chance to the Republicans, I can't verify that because then if anyone wins, I'm technically correct. Because if I say it's 55% chance and Kelly wins, well, that's a 45% chance. That's pretty likely. That could happen. Even if I said it was a 95% chance, Kelly winning is not that unlikely. That'd be like saying I'm going to roll a D20 and get a 20. Well, that happens frequently. The problem is, with percent models, is you, as a consumer of electoral models and electoral analysis, don't know if I've calibrated it or if my number is just nonsense. Because I guarantee you there are many people in this field who are doing this to try to mislead people or try to buoy their vote by increasing donations and turnout by making it more favorable to their preferred candidates. That's on your end. And on my end, you can't calibrate it. So I don't know if I'm right or not. If I said that, again, we're going to say Arizona, if I said it's 55% chance Masters is going to win, and he wins, am I right? Am I wrong? Like, the only way I could calibrate that is if we had 100 disjoint elections in Arizona between Masters and Kelly. Probably more like 10,000, honestly. And there was no information sharing between elections. If that happened, then I could tell you what the percent likelihood is. I could tell you what the margin of error of my forecast is. But we only get one 2022 Senate election between Kelly and Masters in Arizona. There will never be a second one. Because any follow-up vote, in reality, is going to be biased by the previous vote. For example, in Arizona, if Masters wins narrowly, which my model is currently forecasting him, I think he's only up 0.2%. Well, if you did another vote between those two candidates in the same political climate, and that's the other big thing, political climates change, but it was the same political climate, the same voters, and the same two candidates, you are likely going to see higher turnout happen. Sure, hypothetically, if you had 100% turnout, you could do it 100 times and probably get a realistic likelihood, but that would require getting every voter to vote 100 times, or 10,000 times, or 10,000 likely better, but 100 would work probably. But you're not going to get that. That's not going to happen. No one's ever going to do that. So you can't actually calibrate a percent. So anyone who says percent likelihood, nonsense. And I also don't like lean, likely, tilt, because that doesn't mean anything. What does that mean? I will colloquially use those terms, but when I use those terms, I'm referring to particular margin bands. If I say tilt, I mean less than 2% lead. 2 percentage point lead. If I say lean, I typically mean less than a 5 percentage point lead. Likely is less than 10, and safe is more than 20. And I guess there's a band there that I don't have any word for, but that's generally what I mean. But some people, some models will put out, this is likely. I'll pick on Real Clear Politics. They'll be like, this is a safe district. There's not really any reason to me why, or there's no obvious meaning to that term on their website. Maybe I haven't seen it. Maybe it's there, because would not be the first time I missed something like that. But there's no clear meaning to what it means on their website. It seems to be an editorial choice. And yes, if you're doing modeling, if you're doing electoral forecasting, there's a lot of editorial choices in how you handle this. Do you consider every poll? That is a choice by itself, because some pollsters and some polls are terrible. How do you handle polls that have different quantities of data? In my case, my model considers race, sex, age, education, income, and in states where it's available, party affiliation, but not every poll has all of those things. Oh, and previous vote intention, or that vote in the last election. Not every poll has all those things. So how do you handle income? Oh, and urbanicity, forget about that too. Anyways, how do you handle polls that don't cover all of those things? That is an editorial choice, because there's no obvious way to do that. There are better ways and there are worse ways, but there's no objective way to handle that. The only objective thing you can do in modeling is take every pollster with a good track record and do a naive average, or maybe a weighted average based on how old the poll is. But even then, how much do you weight old polls versus new polls? So all of this to say, you can't really do percentage because you can't calibrate it. You can't do a margin of error because you also can't calibrate it. And since you are doing things that are not random sampling, historical error correction, weighted average of polls based on recency bias, etc., that invalidates the idea of a statistical random sample. And that also is further impacted by modern polling going more heavily and heavily into online panels, which by definition are not random. So those can't even use a margin of error per se. Most pollsters with online panels will quote a margin of error if their panel was a random sample, but it's not a random sample, so that margin of error doesn't mean anything. It might be accurate, but it's not statistically valid. And then you take online polls, you take telephone polls, you take pollsters with good records, pollsters with bad records, new pollsters, old pollsters, different quantities of data, different thoroughness of the data. You combine all that together, you can get a good model. I have a good track record at this, but it's not valid in the sense of margin of error or percentages. I hope that makes sense. That was a bit long-winded, but I will put a timestamp in the description if you want to skip this or something. I don't know. Maybe I won't. Who knows? Now, what has happened? And the reason I say this is not too much has happened. There's not many races here. So, I will note as well, I did change some of the colors just to have more contrast. That doesn't actually change any of the bands here, but for example, I made the pink color, I colored Georgia in last week, a paler pinkish color. So it has more contrast because I thought it wasn't contrasting enough. Anyways, so the only ones that really had big changes is New Hampshire fell to a just 3. Was it a 3% or was it? I think it's only like a 2% lead. I have to double check this now. Or wait, checking this live will be too hard. I believe it was down to a 2 percentage point lead for. No, it was less than 2%. I think it was like 1 lead for Hassan. I think that's. Oh man, there's too many people here. Anyways, I think it's Hassan. Less than a 1% lead. That makes so much more sense when it's happening. This is based off the last couple polls and a couple changes to handle stuff better. Don't worry about the details there. It's not that important. I'm not fundamentally changing the model. I'm just tweaking some things, small things. In relation to what to do when you have polls that don't have all the data you need. But anyways. This kind of result for New Hampshire makes much more sense to me than what my model was spitting out before the last wave of polls in New Hampshire, because Hassan in 2016 won by the skin of her teeth, and all of the indicators are all like the economy sucks, we're on the brink of potentially major war in Europe, tensions in the world are going up, inflation's really bad, etc., crime's really bad. I'm not sure about New Hampshire specifically, but in a lot of the country. So, Hassan going from winning by like a quarter of a point to winning by like 6 or something last week, that seemed unbelievable. Now she's winning by the skin of her teeth again. That seems much more plausible. I don't really care what you think about the candidate by themselves, whether you think Bolduc is too extreme or not. I have heard people argue that, and maybe, but in my experience, people really oversell the radicalness of candidates. Most candidates are not actually that radical, especially in the US. Because most candidates in the US are, I think almost all of them actually, I guess there might be some that win uncontested, but pretty much every candidate is run in a contested primary by many other candidates, so the person winning typically has support of quite a large base of that party. So, in general terms, they have a large base, and a lot of people vote partisan. They don't vote for candidates, they vote partisan. So if you have already a large base of people who like the candidate, people vote partisan, you're going to have a lot of votes regardless of whether that person is extreme or moderate. Now, I would even argue in a lot of cases, a lot of these quote-unquote extreme candidates, either Democrat or Republican, actually outperform milquetoast moderates, especially in the age of the internet, because being interesting and decisive on issues matters more. People today care much more than people 40 years ago about people having clear worldviews. Having kind of like a muddly, case-by-case basis, centrist-y worldview as a politician, likely, I was not alive in the 80s, but it seems historically was an asset in the 80s. But today, you look at pretty much every significant election in Western countries in the last decade, 2 decades, let's say even this century so far. The more dynamic, more interesting candidates typically win. Now, there's more to it than that, but people who are milquetoast centrists typically don't win. Because one of the biggest things, especially in the US, on how you win an election is you get voter turnout to increase, and one of the ways you get voter turnout to increase is by being exciting. So all this to say, I don't think Bolduc himself will depress the Republican vote share in New Hampshire. Whether he seemed as too radical in New Hampshire or not might stop him from winning, but it's not going to wildly change the margin of victory for Hassan, who, by all accounts, from what I've seen, is also seen as, by polling a lot, is also seen as quite radical in New Hampshire. She's not necessarily the most radical, but she's definitely much further to the left to the average New Hampshireite. So, it's not like she's even occupying the political center to Bolduc's right wing. It's kind of like the left wing and the right wing, and no one's in the center. So it should make sense that this is going to be likely a close race. Moving to Pennsylvania, nothing really changed here color-wise. Fetterman's lead decreased a bit. He's only leading about 3. Last week he was around 4. And it looks like polls are trending away from him. The question here is, will it continue to trend enough for Oz to pull out a victory, considering it's, 25 days to go? That I'm not sure about. It wouldn't be unheard of, but I don't really expect the trajectory. It doesn't look steep enough for Oz to pull out a last-minute victory here. Maybe. It's not impossible, and maybe there's going to be a big surprise, or there's going to be a complete collapse of the Fetterman campaign. There is, I believe, a debate scheduled on October 25th or something. So maybe that will torpedo Fetterman, but I'm actually of the opinion that that debate might just actually do the opposite. Assuming Fetterman doesn't completely fold like a piece of wet paper towel, I think it might be bad for Oz, because most of Fetterman's voters, by polling, have expressed that they will be voting in early polls or mail-in ballot. So they will already have voted before the debate. So even if they change their mind, they've already voted. Which is one of the reasons I don't like early voting or mail-in ballots. Early voting is not, early in-person voting is not the worst thing in the world. I just don't like it when it happens well in advance of Election Day. But mail-in ballots are ridiculous. I might go into a different video at some other point, but regardless of the security of mail-in ballots or not, and I have voted by mail-in ballot before, I think any election by mail-in ballot intrinsically is a less legitimate election for lack of... I guess I'll touch into it real quick here. But basically, what makes a legitimate election is, like, some of the core factors here are secret ballots and one voter, one vote. Mail-in ballots completely and utterly violate secret ballot. The ballot's not secret anymore. The reason why we have secret ballots is because people will pressure other people to vote the way they want to vote. Either with money, threats, blackmail, whatever, or just browbeating them. You have ballots that are in people's houses. Their family and their friends can browbeat them, can threaten them, can bribe them to vote the way they want, and they can have assurance that that vote was actually cast that way because they can watch them do it. It intrinsically makes the election less legitimate because it's less fair because you've removed secrecy of ballot. That's the main opposition to it. And I think any reasonable country should ban it. And I think every political party should ban it. Because I know in Canada the Conservative Party here does elections by mail-in ballot. And that's really dumb. We shouldn't do that. Anyways, back to the US here. Sorry for that digression. Going into Wisconsin and North Carolina, they're kind of cruising along. Some recent market poll showed Johnson really far in the lead. So maybe he will, what's the word for it? Wisconsin will probably move up into the same, like, 5 to 10 range band soon. He's up at the top of 4 now. Doesn't really mean anything. Wisconsin was likely always going Republican, so winning by a larger margin, I guess, probably feels better for Johnson, but doesn't really mean anything in the scope of things. We'll just skip over these two for a moment, and we'll go to Washington and Nevada. Washington is unchanged because there's been no new polls that I saw since last week. Maybe I missed them. And Nevada, Laxalt, I still don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. He's extended his lead. He's now up like 6-7-ish by my model. Yes, it's quite bullish on the raw polling, but I had my reasons for it. And I will note there is larger margin of error on these Senate races, and I haven't... It's a variant of my model that I haven't forecast before. So we will see. There might be some calibration issues, but I'm pretty confident on this one because everyone else doing this, whether I think they're good or not, is also forecasting Nevada winning to the Republicans. So the only possible issue might be overestimation, but I don't think so. The polling is pretty clear to me here. But moving on to the two interesting states here, and the ones that will decide the Senate-ish. New Hampshire might also possibly decide the Senate, but these two are the big ones. Because it looks like Pennsylvania's probably a D flip and Nevada's probably an R flip at this point. They could change. Doesn't seem likely, though. So, Arizona is razor thin. I decided to color it in a slightly different manner than last week. The margin's not wildly different, but it's now like 0.2 for Masters. Razor thin. I suspect if Masters does win, he's going to be winning by effectively one of two things. So option one, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Option one is Kari Lake is going to turn out people because she's generally speaking more popular than Masters himself in Arizona. So she might carry Masters over the line by turning out more Republicans and independents who then just vote down our down ticket. That is very possible. And that will likely objectively happen. The question just is, will it be enough to actually change the race? I suspect so, and very slightly. Kelly himself is losing popularity in Arizona, and a lot of independents in Arizona are not very happy that he's basically voted party line on every vote. Arizonans seem to prefer their senators to be more independent John McCain and both Christine Sinema are both kind of in that vein where they're more independent from their parties. And they were both relatively popular, or McCain was popular in Arizona, and Sinema seems to be relatively popular. It looks like she should win re-election in next cycle, assuming she's not primaried. So it's likely, or not likely is the wrong word, it's looking like Masters is going to narrowly edge it out. I know some of you are going to be saying, oh, the polls are showing much, like, Kelly has a good lead. The polls showed Kelly had a very big lead in 2020, and he barely won. He was being up like 5-6 points, and he only won by like 1 or 2. I can't remember the exact margin off the top of my head. So I would be very cautious with that. Just looking at raw polls, they can be useful, especially if you're looking at good pollsters with good track records. But be careful when you're looking at some pollsters, because some of them really suck. Especially right now. I think Quinnipiac might be one of them. They're very not. In general, Quinnipiac is not a very good pollster. They have a very bad track record the last 6 years or so. Maybe historically they did better, but I don't really care what they did 10 years ago because that's 10 years ago. Polling and election modeling and elections are a recency bias industry. So this goes us to Georgia. Now, Georgia, Walker has lost more ground from last week. He was at about 2.2 last week, and now he's sitting at like 1-ish, let's say like 1.2, so he's lost about another point. I suspect the blowback from the scandals he had, namely paying for, I'm not sure if it's actually confirmed yet. I'm going to say allegedly, just in case. Allegedly paying for abortions of some, I'm not sure how many, women he had impregnated, being the namely one, and also allegedly being a bad father. That's alleged by his son. So take with that what you will. These have definitely hurt him. I think primarily with independents. Though, I think it is worth noting that while it's shown in the polls in independents, I suspect it probably hurt him with Republicans, and it might be the case that Republicans just might not vote. The might not want to vote for him. The savior for him in that regard is that Brian Kemp is also on the ballot, and Kemp is, generally speaking, relatively popular among Republicans in Georgia, and will likely get Republicans in Georgia to turn out to vote for him, and Walker might be saved because the Republicans who would have not voted if it was just Walker on the ballot might vote, put checkmark by his name, just because they're already there to vote for Kemp, or possibly their local representative, but unlikely. People don't typically turn out just to vote for their local representative, unless you were always going to turn out, in which case you were going to turn out anyways. So he might be saved there, and there's been a couple scandals blowing up with Warnock, which also might save him. It's very possible, though, between both of these sets of scandals. Oh, and to be clear, the Warnock scandals are that he was allegedly evicting people in the pandemic for like farcically low quantities of back rent. Like one was like $29, I think, allegedly. So that's also pretty hurting him, among other things. So I think it's very likely here that Georgia won't actually have either candidate at 50%, and we will see a runoff in January? I think it's when their runoffs are. If that does happen, I'm inclined to think Warnock might win. If only because there won't be anyone else on the ballot to encourage turnout. What we saw in 2020 is the Republican Senate candidates in 2020 in Georgia, vote share, like number of voters decreased following round 1 into round 2, and I suspect largely that was because people like Trump weren't on the ballot in the runoff. So people who turned out for Trump and then decided to mark R or check mark the Senate candidate didn't show up in round 2 because they weren't excited by either candidate. I suspect that might be the case again in Georgia if the Senate race is under 50%, and right now it is under 50%. I think Walker's like 49 in the model. It's, you know what, for once I will actually just pull this up because it's not the most trivial thing in the world to get the result offhand. I have to actually run the application. Yeah, so right now I have Walker at about 49-ish. So it is extremely likely neither candidate will get above 50. It's not impossible, but it's likely. Because it's kind of the same. You might kind of see the same story you're seeing a couple of the other races where the governor and Senate race at the same time, where the relatively more popular Republican governor candidate might carry the relatively less popular Senate candidate. But I'm not sure that's going to be enough in Georgia because unlike Masters in Arizona, where Masters doesn't seem to have any major red flags for him, this scandal for Walker is pretty bad and might sink his race. Because, again, the core thing and why I think this might sink him is it might cause voters to just not vote for him. I don't think they're going to vote for Warnock. They just might not vote for him. Because keep in mind, I don't know how likely this is or how frequent this is, but it is not impossible for you to mark Kemp, mark your congressional candidate, and leave the Senate blank if you don't like them. That's very possible. They could protest vote by voting a third party or something if they don't like the candidate. There's plenty of options people might do if they don't like Walker. And the scandals that Walker's accused in, on paper, shouldn't affect any Democrats, largely, or I'm going to phrase this, shouldn't affect any pro-choicers because what he did is what pro-choicers generally support. Generally. What it would do, and this is why it's a problem, is this would deeply offend most pro-lifers. He might get the benefit if it's long enough in the past, and he can argue that I've changed and that was when I was being dumb. He might save himself with that, but pro-lifers will generally not be very happy with something like that. That is a very bad scandal for someone who's trying to court a pro-life vote. Because at that point, you're basically just saying to a pro-lifer that you paid the woman you impregnated to murder her child. That's pretty bad. Like, that's up there in bad things. Possibly one of the worst things. So, his only saving grace is if he can genuinely convince voters that he's changed his mind and he's not that. And I expect if he does win, either he will get primaried out in 6 years and just get tossed off the curb, or he's going to become the most rabidly pro-life Republican publicly as a manner of saving face. How long will he be like that? I'm not sure, but if he is elected, expect him to be acting rabidly pro-life for quite a while to try to, build up his credentials that I've changed my mind. What I did in my past was horrible. It was the worst thing ever. I shouldn't have done it, but we gotta do things. We gotta ban this stuff now, so no one else will do that again. If he does that, I could see him salvaging his position. Will it be enough? I don't know, but I could see it working. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he did that and he managed to win. If he doesn't take a strong stance like that, I think he's likely only going to win if Kemp carries him, or if Warnock's campaign implodes, but Warnock's scandal doesn't look like it's going to be enough to destroy him. In fact, the Warnock scandals might only be enough to keep Walker competitive. So they're kind of mutually assured destruction here. Which, in the realm of politics, mutually assured destruction in a two-way race just keeps things status quo, I suppose. Interesting food for thought there. But with that, I will wrap this up here. If you liked the video, smash the like button. Press subscribe so you can wait for or stay tuned for more stuff. And comment below if you think I'm full of shit, or if have some intelligent wisdom here, or if you like, I don't know, you think I missed something, or you see something neat. I don't know. Do you have any insights on any of these races? If you're from any of these states that I'm highlighting, by all means, I love your anecdotes. Anecdotes are great when you're talking about interpreting what's happening in an election. One of my favorite things about doing this is I get to talk to people about elections while the elections are happening. Now, mind you, I have a really biased subsample because I'm only talking to the most politically active people, but it's extremely interesting, and I really like it. So always throw the comments about what your thoughts on the election in your area. It's super useful. I cannot stress how much useful it is. It's not data, but you can't interpret data unless you have a theory, right? Anecdotes help you build a theory to interpret the data, and if your interpretation of the data is correct, and for example, and I forecast the election correctly, that validates my theory, which is based off the anecdotes. Does that make sense? Love your anecdotes. Throw them at me. Throw them at me. Bathe me in them. That'd be weird, but sticking by it. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you Sunday with more congressional election update. More? Another. Haha. Anyways, goodbye for now.